really it's unfair that Monument Valley can sort of scream the West just sort of instantly, right? It generated so much wealth in the representation industry, yet that wealth hasn't sort of trickled back to the Navajo people themselves.
From the Autry Museum, located on Tongva homelands in Los Angeles, California, join us in asking, what is a Western? Welcome. Our guest today is Liza Black. She is an assistant professor of history and Native American and Indigenous Studies at Indiana University. And she is a citizen of the Cherokee Nation and the author of Picturing Indians, Native Americans in Film, 1941 to 1960. Welcome.
Thank you. Thank you so much for having me.
No, we're thrilled, and congratulations on the book coming out.
Thank you so much.
Your book is very interesting because it sort of draws us outside the frame of the movies that we watch, if we watch historic movies, and into thinking about these as sets, as places of workplaces, in this case for Native American people. And I was just wondering if you could just give us a little background on the people that you're writing about and the work that they did on movies.
Absolutely. And I just would like to first thank you for having me. And also just to let you know that I'm coming to you from Chumash territory. I want to acknowledge that I'm on Chumash land in Ventura, California. So yes, I was really interested in looking at films as a place where people work. So I was looking at the makeup artists, the costumers, the food prep people, amongst others. There's just so many people who work on film sets, and it really takes all of their work to create these movies that we all enjoy. So looking at Native people, though, in particular, they were typically the performers or the actors or the extras. So let's think about Jay Silverheels or Harry Smith, who's on the cover of my book. A person like Jay or Harry Smith never would have had a lead role. We think sort of as Tonto as a lead role in The Lone Ranger, but really it's a supporting role. Clayton Moore really has the lead role. So it's important to remember that as well, that Native characters, just in terms of how they were written into films, meant that they only had supporting roles. A man like Harry Smith, who is a Mohawk man, in fact, from the Six Nations Reserve in Canada, used this name, Jay Silverheels, obviously to sort of get traction with casting agents and sort of fit into that stereotype that the movie industry has about Native people. Harry Smith had over 100 film credits, probably even much more than that if you include television. And I would say he had a commanding presence, even in the limiting role of Tonto. He still sort of has this presence and this charisma even. But in spite of working nonstop for decades, generating tremendous wealth for the many studios where he worked, Harry struggled financially his entire life. In LA, he rented a one-bedroom apartment in Hollywood. He died in legal debt. He suffered from medical malpractice, and he dragged himself through a legal battle until the day he passed away. Now, just another sad note, he's on the cover of my book, and I think the book looks amazing, and I think he is an incredible actor and a really handsome man, but he got no money. His family got no money for this image on the cover of my book. But it just goes to show just how little control he had over his image, and especially how little he earned from his own image. So another man, sort of very similar to Harry Smith, but probably less well known to our listeners, is Daniel Simmons. So Daniel Simmons is a member of the Yakima Nation, and like Harry Smith, he used this name that sort of is silly and doesn't really mean anything. He used the name Chief Yowlatchie to sort of indicate a certain type of Indian, a name that would indicate to casting agents that this is a Native American man. So he used this name, Chief Yowlatchie, to define himself and present himself as a Native American. And like Harry, he has over 100 film credits. He worked for decades in Hollywood. But as far as I know, he never owned a home in Los Angeles. In fact, he rented a granny flat in East LA while he was working for these studios. So in terms of extras, I was just as interested in extras, perhaps even more so than I was the actors. So there's several Native men who have these supporting roles like Harry and Daniel who are in the book, but there's hundreds, maybe even thousands of Native extras who worked in these movies of the 1940s and 1950s. In some cases, I have an image of that person from the archive and their name, like this example of Plainfeather, who was a Crow man who worked in Warpath, as well as Donald Deernose, who was also a Crow man who worked in Warpath for Paramount as well. But more often than not, I don't have photos of these Native extras and I don't have their names. Here you see an image of a Dene woman who was not named, being posed with her baby and the white actress on set. I believe it's Eleanor Parker from Escape from Fort Bravo. So actually one of my hopes is that I'll find out who these people are once the images get out there and the book gets out there, that people will recognize their family members.
The two examples you gave from the Crow Nation, how did you find out who they were? Was it labeled on the image, or were there other ways of finding that out?
That's a great question. So oftentimes I would not find their name on the photograph. I would, of course, know which movie it came from, because that's just how they're archived as a group of photos from a particular film. But it's usually with other archival materials from the studio's own records that I would find out who it was. So with Donald Deernose, I don't think he was labeled in the caption, but I think I had other records that told me it was him. With Plainfeather, I did not know that was him. They had him mislabeled as Ben American Horse. And it was really crazy because a really good friend of mine is the cousin of the great-grandson of Plainfeather. And somehow we figured this out and we were able to identify Plainfeather. So that's a great question, because even when we don't know who they are, it can sort of happen that, Native people are able to identify their family members simply because they know what they look like.
Right. Most of us are familiar with Western movies, especially of this era, and how they have this sort of stereotypical portrayal, and that they are sort of anti-Native American in a lot of ways, or that the Native people are kind of the villains and they're kind of stereotyped. And some of the images you show, I'm curious of like how the narrative of the film relates to the story that turns up in your historical research.
When I went to the studio archives, they always told me they had nothing about Native people in their archives. And I had to be really pushy to get access to these materials. And so I wouldn't take no for an answer. And I just said, well, bring me everything you have for Far Horizons or Drumbeat or Escape from Fort Bravo. And I would just go through every single piece of paper and image in their boxes. And then, lo and behold, as I imagined, there was documentation about usually extras who played Native people on screen. So that's sort of the first part of this, is that's how I found those records, to be able to talk about Native people in these movies as workers, not as people on screen. So that's the first part. The second part is that I was truly astonished when I opened these boxes with these photographs, which are not published anywhere. They weren't even published at the time, showing this story of friendship between Native people and non-natives on set. Almost always. There was almost never any imagery from set that was meant to be used as publicity that mimicked the story of the film. So I found that really astonishing, that the studios were so committed to these anti-Native narratives, and yet on set they were so committed to showing that Native people and whites were deeply friendly with each other on set. So I find that, I continue to find that totally fascinating.
And was that just public relations, or was there some truth to the kind of friendly atmosphere on set? What, I mean, have you found any sort of oral histories or any sort of record of what it was actually like?
Well, maybe we should look at a couple of, or talk about
Okay,
specifically about a couple of photos first,
right.
and then I'll talk about what I know
Hmm.
definitively about what Native people thought about
Hmm.
life on set and their interactions with these actors. So when I say that these films present a sort of simple story of white innocence and Native violence, that's truly what I mean. And this first image is from Drumbeat, and we see, well, we don't see the studio photographer, but we know there's a studio photographer there taking a photo of two anonymous Apache young women who are taking a photo of Charles Bronson in costume as Captain Jack. And he's sort of leaning back in his chair with his foot up on a pose. Not seductive, but this sort of assertive way. So there's a certain amount of sort of attraction or friendship or something that they're trying to communicate in this image. And these two Native girls, teenagers or young women, don't look miserable. If the studio asked them to take this photo, it seems like they're having fun with this. And yet this movie, Drumbeat, is a, I would say, deeply anti-Modoc story of the Modoc War, and it ends with the execution of Captain Jack. So there's nothing sort of playful or friendly
Hmm.
in the movie. In fact, this is an image of an Apache extra whose name I don't know, taking a photo quite up close of Bill Holden, and Bill Holden has this huge smile on his face. Bill Holden's definitely having fun in this photo, and I don't know, it seems like maybe the Apache extra is as well. And then, of course, the studio photographer is capturing all of this through his camera. Yet Escape from Fort Bravo is not about friendship or play between white men and Native men. In fact, it's a film about the Civil War. It's about whites who are divided because of the Civil War between North and South. And they only come together when Apaches come in, you know, with absolutely no valid reason, attacking supposedly innocent whites. So
Hmm.
again, there's this opposition between these images. This is an image of Herman St. Clair, who was the tribal chairperson of the Shoshone Nation. So he's surrounded by Shoshone men, and he's offering Donna Reed, who is in costume at a Sacagawea, he is offering her a fishing permit because the tribe held and holds sovereign fishing rights that go back to the Fort Bridger Treaty of 1868. This has nothing. Tribal sovereignty and reserved rights by tribal nations has nothing to do with Far Horizons,
Hmm.
which came out in 1955 as an entirely settler colonial narrative with Lewis and Clark as the heroes of the sort of white supremacist story. So yes, these oppositional narratives are so fascinating to me. And then to your question of, you know, what did Native people think, right? What were these Native people actually thinking when they were being posed with these photographs, or what did they think of what they saw on set? I don't know for sure what the people in these photos thought because I don't know who they are exactly.
Hmm.
But I have definitely seen evidence that comes from the studios, in fact, that sometimes Native actors and extras sort of poked fun at the
Hmm.
stories that were being told for the camera. They definitely knew what the storyline was, and they made fun of the fact that the studios would have tribes of one nation play another nation. They thought that was, you know, silly. They thought it was silly that, you know, Indians always lost,
Hmm.
and they would poke fun about that. So, and you can only imagine how much there was going on of that, because I only saw evidence of that in the studio archive. So even the studios sometimes thought this was funny
Hmm.
or clever or something and would include it in press releases. I did interview a few people, and it seemed like their position was they just didn't really care about the movie, that they just sort of wanted to get in, get out, make some cash, get it over with, move along. And one man, Billy Yellow, this Dene or Navajo man, never even saw any of the films. And I think that's the case with many of these extras, at least in the 40s and 50s. That might not be true today. I'm sure people today would make sure that they see their films.
You're talking about people who are extras on films filmed outside of Los Angeles, right? They're filmed especially on the Navajo Nation. What were the economic circumstances that people are working in? I mean, in terms of what other opportunities for work were there, or what was the context of sort of doing this? Was it just kind of fun, extra bonus money, or is there a real need for that cash?
There is definitely a real need for that cash. Maybe some of your viewers already know this, but the Navajo Nation was sort of still reeling really from removal and then relocation, which devastated their nation in spite of now being on their ancestral lands. That relocation that they suffered, still is impacting the Navajo Nation today. Then they had livestock reduction. That's still sort of, having its impact on the Navajo Nation. Then you have uranium mining coming in mid-century. So for sure, when these movies were being made, that would have been a possibility for these extras, was to work in mining. But as we know, that's really poor pay and really dangerous work. Dangerous at that time, but incredibly dangerous long-term in terms of physical health and well-being. So the options were definitely limited. Many Navajos at that time did not have electricity or plumbing, and many relied on livestock. So this was definitely a real opportunity for Navajo people that felt perhaps less dangerous than other work, but probably demeaning nonetheless.
Mm-hmm.
And they certainly could have been better paid. I keep seeing these images around John Ford and him sort of claiming that he paid the Navajo Nation so much. He really didn't. He really didn't. When you look at their profits and their investment, they really did not invest much at all in the Navajo extras. And the Dene extras didn't make any more than they would have if they lived in LA and were not.
Are there particular sort of films or incidents or people that stand out that really struck you that you wish people knew more about, or more people knew more about?
I would say two things. One, I would like to talk about the fact that there's very few pictures in my book. And the reason there are very few pictures in my book is that it's really complex who owns these movies. There's been a lot of shifting in the movie industry since the 40s, with companies buying out other companies, and it just becomes really unclear who actually holds title to those films. So it was really difficult figuring out who owned these films and who owned the rights to these amazing images that I found in the archives. So Warner Brothers turned out to be the one mostly who owned nearly everything that I had looked at. Warner Brothers gave me permission to use all the images in my book. So as the book went into production, there were numerous photographs in the book, and we had in writing by email that Warner Brothers was going to give permission and that a contract would follow. Well, they started dragging their feet and asking a lot of questions about my book. While the book was in production, I mean in the late stages of production, they pulled permission and they put that in writing. So I wish people would think about who's making money from these films. The second thing I would say is that there's a lot about the Dene Nation in my book. And maybe people want to know more about the Dene people. So there's many tribal nations talked about in the book, but I would say the most sustained analysis is of the Dene or Navajo. And really what I'm trying to get at is how the Navajo people were exploited by the movie industry, as well as the tourist industry, as well as the uranium industry. And how really it's unfair that Monument Valley can sort of scream the West just sort of instantly, right? It's firmly equated with the West now, and yet the Dene people still suffer in many ways from poverty. And this just seems entirely unfair to me, that it's generated so much wealth in the representation industry, yet that wealth hasn't sort of trickled back to the Navajo people themselves. And so a couple of movies I might recommend to people, in addition to reading my book, would be The Return of Navajo Boy. This is an incredible film that I talk about extensively in the book. This deals with the film industry's exploitation of the Dene people, but also about Navajo children being separated from their parents by missionaries and adoption agencies, and then also about the incredibly destructive impact of the uranium industry on Navajo people themselves, as well as Navajo land. And then another film I'd love to recommend is Basketball or Nothing. Well, it's not a film, it's a series on Netflix about the Chinle High School basketball teams trying to make it to the state finals, and a documentary about that effort. And then lastly, I would recommend Drunk Town's Finest. And this gives insight into gender and sexuality amongst people today.
That is fascinating what you say about Monument Valley, in that we hear about and think about a lot of ways that native lands have been kind of plundered in lots of, for oil or for uranium or for all these things. But in terms of sort of as imagery, it's a resource that has been, it's maybe not, I don't know whether it's as damaging as mining uranium, but the landscape of Monument Valley is such a perfect example of a resource that is on Navajo land and that a lot of people have made a lot of money off of who are non-Navajo.
And it was just so surprising to me, or not surprising, it just, the angle I'm really trying to push here is that, yes, these images are demeaning of Native people from the 40s and 50s. And what's more demeaning, though, is that they didn't even make good money from it. Right? I mean, there's a lot that people would be willing to do for high pay, but Native people really did not earn much at all from these images.
Right. When you're hearing about they didn't necessarily take the imagery as seriously maybe as we do in terms of reading the text of the film and so on, but they did take this seriously, what they're getting for a day's work.
Oh, for sure, for sure. The studio even documented that they did not appreciate how lengthy negotiations would sometimes be with Navajo people about issues with their animals, especially because they wanted to talk about all the details of their family life and their animal husbandry while they were on set, and they wanted to work out all the details around, well, how will we get water for our animals, and we have to be able to have our children on set with us, and found examples of, especially around photography, you know, the Navajo have been so exploited for imagery. Sorry, there's a train going by. That they tried to make sure that the studio could not take pictures without their consent and without special payment.
Wow.
And the studios did not like any of this. They felt that they were just sort of supposed to be able to come in and do whatever they wanted.
So they were using Navajo people's livestock too, their horses and yeah.
Yes, but also Navajo people, even if the studio didn't want to use their livestock, they did not want to leave their livestock at home.
Gotcha.
They would try to get some kind of arrangements made so that they could have their animals with them, so they could have their children with them. And the studios were just like totally shocked that they had to negotiate all this.
Did they manage to sometimes bring like family and livestock on, like near the set?
Absolutely. And sometimes they did get paid for using their children or their animals on set. And I did find one example, which might not even be true because it's according to the studio, of a Navajo man who they really liked the look of and they liked his speaking, and they wanted him to come to LA for just a few follow-up shots. And he just didn't want to. And they couldn't believe it, right? Because people in LA, non-Native people in LA, are just so desperate to get in front of that camera and get money. And they just couldn't believe that he didn't want to leave. So this whole idea of being deeply committed to your children and to your animals and to your home was just totally foreign to the studios.
Wow. As we watch his old films and think about them? How could we sort of think more historically as film viewers and as just citizens?
Well, I'd like to answer your question with a series of questions, which is
Okay.
a great teaching strategy. So I would ask viewers to ask themselves things while they're watching a movie and enjoying a movie. I would ask them to think about, well, what is history? We don't really think about what history is, but what is it? And what's left out in these historical narratives we're watching, and what is valued in these filmic narratives of the past? And ask yourself, am I being asked as a viewer to sympathize with some characters but not with others? And what does that mean, or how does that make me feel or think or believe as I'm watching that film? And to ask yourself about the vantage point. Whose vantage point is this? The camera is pointed in a certain direction, and there's a reason they're doing that, and it's supposed to evoke a feeling in you. So ask yourself, whose viewpoint is this from? And then also to ask yourself, really, is it ethical to non-critically embrace and enjoy movies that are really actually sort of about white supremacy and nationalism, and that destroy indigenous people and celebrate whites conquering natives? I mean, is that ethical? And then I would say, ask yourself, are who's being allowed to have character development in this film? That's one thing that sort of bothered me so much about the films I watched, is that Native people were just allowed so little in terms of arc and character. And then lastly, always follow the money. Ask yourself, who's making money from this movie? Is it only the studio? Is it really famous actors? How are these studios treating people who they don't have to treat well? So maybe that is not what people want to hear, because we watch movies to have a good time. We watch movies to relax. We watch movies to laugh and to sort of forget about our problems. So, sorry.
Historians are kind of a buzzkill sometimes. Yeah. Oh, well.
I don't know what to say. I mean, I was watching this interview with Gary Farmer that some institution did a week or two ago, and it was about the celebration of the 25-year anniversary of Dead Man.
Mm-hmm.
And it was so fascinating because they kept showing these clips of Gary Farmer in Dead Man that sort of left out Johnny Depp.
Mm-hmm.
And I was thinking, this is sort of how Native people watch movies. They sort of ignore what they don't want to think about, and they sort of focus on the Native actor who's on screen, and they sort of express their fandom that way. And so often a movie is enjoyable if you sort of block out certain parts of it and just focus on the actors you enjoy. Mm-hmm. So that's another strategy you can employ.
I kind of love where we just ended in a way, but
okay, good.
The Autry Museum of the American West thanks our members and supporters.